Hi class, Professor Pronte here, and this video is going to show you how to calculate and identify deadweight loss. This is one of the trickier problems that you're going to encounter in this chapter. As always, this video is going to build on an earlier one, so make sure that you've seen the earlier videos about understanding what consumer surplus is, what producer surplus is, and how we identify that on a graph, because that's going to be really foundational for taking on this type of a problem. All right, on the big board here behind me, I have a graph where I'm showing supply and demand. We're representing a market that's in equilibrium. And this is how you're going to want to start off all problems thinking about deadweight loss. All right, and so you can see here that this triangle up on the top that's been shaded in black pen, that's showing us the consumer surplus for the whole market. And again, what does that mean? Consumer surplus is a measure of well-being or welfare for buyers. And the way that you find it on a graph is that it's the area underneath the demand curve, right? Underneath that demand line, but above the price line, so above that dashed P1 for all the units that are bought and sold. Right, all the way out there to Q1. That definition is super important. I'll link that into the module so that you can have that as we're going through this. Consumer surplus is under demand, above the price, going all the way out for all units bought and sold. The difference between what people are willing to pay, which we get from the demand curve, what they have to pay, which is the price. Producer surplus is really quite similar, but it's the surplus that is accrued by sellers. Right? People sell the good for some price. The supply curve tells us that they would be willing to accept a lower price. And so that difference is producer surplus. And when we aggregate that across all the units that are bought and sold in here, we have this blue triangle representing the producer surplus for all of the sellers of this good. Okay. And so one punchline is that in usual circumstances, for most products, if you use a process associated with the market, we leave it to supply and demand to figure out how this good is going to get provided, we will maximize the total surplus. That is the sum of consumer and producer surplus. It's going to be as big as we can possibly make it. There's no way to get more surplus for some group than what we've got here. Okay. Combining then our welfare analysis that we're talking about here with the price control stuff that we learned about earlier in this chapter. So things like price ceilings, price floors. Remember then that there are situations where we move away from a market equilibrium. We think that P1 is wrong. We want to pull it up, push it down, use a price floor or a price ceiling respectively. So when we do that, right, if the government gets involved and changes this price of P1, it's going to change the amount of total surplus that people are receiving. This is the key for understanding deadweight loss. Right? To say it as simply as I can, the deadweight loss then shows you how much less surplus there is once we move away from an equilibrium, just like we see in this picture here, right? So to find the deadweight loss, what you need to do then is figure out what was the total surplus before some price control was put into place. What is the total surplus after that price control was put into place? And then we want to see what area on our graph is no longer experienced as surplus by one of the groups in question here, the buyers or the sellers. So that's what we're going to do on this graph that I'm covering up behind me right here. So let me scoot my chair over a little bit. I'm going to try not to knock anything over. This is all very precarious over here. Okay. And so what we want to do then is on the second graph that we've got over here on the right side of the screen, once again, figure out the consumer and producer surplus now that we've moved away from P1 and Q1, that equilibrium that we started with. So let's do producer surplus first, because that's an easier one to see on this graph. Look back to your definition. This is going to be really helpful. Right? What's the producer surplus? It's the area underneath the price, but above the supply curve for all units bought and sold. So looking at my graph then, the price that results is going to be P sub C. That's because we've introduced a price ceiling, right? That's the maximum price that we're going to allow for this good. So PC is the price that sellers receive when they sell the good. How much are they willing to take for selling the good? The supply curve shows us that. And so this little baby triangle right here in blue is showing us then the accumulated producer surplus for all those units bought and sold, right? We stop here at QC rather than going all the way out to Q1, because remember, if the price is P sub C, if we have that price ceiling put into place, sellers are only willing and able to sell this quantity of the good. And so because that's the amount of the good available for sale, that's the number of units that are exchanged and transacted. Okay, so our producer surplus is this little baby triangle right here. I'm going to lean out of the way, take a look at this graph behind me, compare the size of this triangle with the producer surplus that we had before the price ceiling. It's gone down, hasn't it? It's much smaller. So because the producer surplus is reduced so significantly here, you should be thinking then, the graph is telling us, our model is telling us that sellers are worse off when we put into place a price ceiling. And I think that should jive and fit with our logic, right? If we put in place a law saying you need to reduce the price that you're charging, we're going to bring this price down, to me that kind of feels like that would be bad news for sellers, and that's the conclusion that we're getting from our model as well. All right, let's look at how this price ceiling would affect the buyers. Well, we're going to find consumer surplus. It's a little bit harder to identify than the producer surplus we just did, but once again, turn back to your definition. Take a minute, pause it, go find that definition of consumer surplus in the module or in your notes, right? It's the area on our graph underneath the demand curve, but above the price that's paid for all units bought and sold. Okay, and so if we're clear on that, we can just reason our way to what area on the graph shows us the consumer surplus. The demand curve is up here. The price that those buyers are paying is P sub C. So this kind of oddly shaped thing that we've got in here that's shaded in black, this represents for us the consumer surplus. Comparing consumer surplus with the price ceiling, like we've got on the graph on the right, and the consumer surplus in an equilibrium like we've got on the left, it doesn't seem obvious to me at first look which shaded area is bigger, right? The consumers gained this little area here in surplus, but they lost this little bit over here, this triangle right there, right? Okay. The final step then in our problem is to figure out the deadweight loss, right? We're asking then, what you're trying to find is what area would be experienced as either consumer or producer surplus before, look at this graph on the left, but is no longer experienced as surplus after we've put in place some price control. We've moved away from the equilibrium. And so the area in question, I've already colored it in, is this little red triangle guy that we've got right here. That's called the deadweight loss triangle. The top half of it, right, this little guy in here above P1 under the demand curve, that used to be consumer surplus. That top triangle, if we cut this in half, used to be consumer surplus, but now it's gone. Nope, nobody's getting that surplus. The bottom part there used to be producer surplus. It's gone. No one's experiencing that. And so this deadweight loss then is showing us a reduction in total surplus to society associated with this price control. Right. Some people in lecture have made the accurate conclusion that this sounds very theoretical, and it is. Right. This isn't something where we're talking about a particular number or something that can be observed directly very easily. Instead, what we're trying to do is to use our model to draw some conclusions about the impact of a price ceiling, a price floor, of externalities, other situations in which we'll have deadweight loss. Okay, guys. This one here is showing us this deadweight loss triangle associated with a price ceiling. Of course, there's other ways that you could encounter a deadweight loss triangle too. That would be a good one for you to work on for practice, and then you can ask me about it either through email or in a conference. If we had, instead of a price ceiling, a price floor, a binding price floor, it's going to also create a deadweight loss. How is the graph going to look? Where's the deadweight loss triangle? Where's the consumer surplus? Where's the producer surplus? Fun questions to think about as you're sitting at home. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next video. Bye now.